The bell of St. Sepulchre began its toll, a heavy iron vibration that rattled the very bones of the city. It was midnight, the hour of the ghost, the hour of the condemned. Lady Eliza Hawthorne stood upon the wooden platform, the midnight fog clinging to her skin like a damp shroud. The executioner's hands were rough, smelling of stale ale and old leather as he adjusted the hemp rope. The fibers were abrasive, scratching against the tender skin of her neck, a cruel contrast to the silk ribbons she had worn only a fortnight ago. Below the stage, the crowd was a sea of shadowed faces, their breath hitching in anticipation of the drop. Eliza closed her eyes, the rhythmic thud of the hangman's boots on the pine boards sounding like a funeral drum. Then the world shattered. A shout erupted from the mist, sharp, authoritative, and followed by the panicked scream of horses. A flash of light, perhaps a carriage lantern or a well-timed flare, blinded the guards. In the heartbeat between life and the void, Eliza felt the rope slacken. A pair of gloved hands, strong as iron and swift as a predator's strike, seized her by the waist. She didn't have time to scream before she was hauled off the platform, the sudden movement stealing the air from her lungs. The biting cold of the London night whipped past her face for one terrifying second, and then she was plunged into darkness. The transition was a sensory whiplash that made her head spin. The roar of the crowd was replaced by the heavy, muffled thud of a carriage door slamming shut, its latch clicking with the finality of a tomb. The air changed instantly. The freezing, cold-choked mist of the courtyard was gone, replaced by a suffocating, opulent warmth. Eliza lay on the floorboards, gasping, her wide, haunted eyes struggling to adjust. The interior of the carriage was a womb of quilted red leather, lit only by the flickering, amber glow of two beeswax candles mounted in silver sconces. The scent was no longer of death and damp earth, but of expensive tobacco, aged brandy, and the clean, sharp smell of the winter air trapped in heavy fabric. "Breathe, Lady Eliza, the gallows do not follow you here." The voice was deep, a resonant baritone that carried the weight of a command. Eliza looked up, her fingers trembling as they clutched the hem of her thin, tattered chemise. Towering over her was Duke Alistair Ravenscroft. He sat upon the velvet bench, an imposing figure of shadows and gold. His heavy cloak, a deep, bruised burgundy, seemed to swallow the light, and the massive wolf fur collar framing his face gave him the appearance of a dark king from a forgotten age. He moved with a grim, focused intensity, leaning down to catch her before she could collapse against the door. His grip on her shoulders was firm, a claim of protection that brooked no argument. Without a word, he unfastened the silver clasp of his cloak and draped the heavy, fur-lined velvet over her shivering frame. The weight of it was immense, a physical barrier between her and the world that had just tried to kill her. Eliza huddled into the furs, her face pale and streaked with the remnants of tears and rain. She looked small, a broken bird seeking shelter in the nest of a hawk. Her hands, calloused and stained from her time in the Newgate cells, reached out instinctively, gripping the Duke's cuffs. The gold embroidery scratched her palms, but she did not let go. She couldn't. He was her only lifeline in a world that had turned into a nightmare of mist and rope. Outside, the carriage lurched forward, the wheels spinning against the cobblestones as the horses were pushed to a gallop. The shouts of the King's Guard grew faint, swallowed by the distance and the thick London fog. Inside the cabin, the silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the leather and the steady, heavy breathing of the man who had just committed high treason to snatch her from the noose. Alistair watched her, his expression unreadable, his eyes reflecting the dancing candle flames. He did not offer empty comforts, he simply watched the color slowly return to her lips, his body shielding her from the jolts of the road. The red leather walls felt safe, yet claustrophobic, a sanctuary built of secrets. Eliza looked at the Duke, the terror still vivid in her gaze. She had escaped the gallows, but as the carriage thundered toward the dark hills of the north, she realized her fate had not merely been saved. It had been utterly transformed. She was no longer a lady, nor a prisoner. She was a ghost riding in the carriage of a man whose shadow was longer than the law itself. The carriage jolted over a deep rut in the cobblestones, throwing Eliza's fragile frame against the Duke's chest. She did not pull away, she couldn't. Her muscles had locked into a state of rigid, crystalline shock. Underneath the heavy weight of the burgundy cloak he had cast over her, Eliza was acutely aware of the pathetic state of her own attire. Her simple, light-colored bodice was damp and thin, the fabric worn almost translucent by weeks in a stone cell. Every time the carriage hit a bump, the fine linen felt like ice against her skin, a stark reminder of how close she had come to being dressed only in a shroud. Alistair Ravenscroft did not speak. He remained a silent, looming monolith of power in the corner of the cabin. His presence was a physical pressure, filling the small space with the scent of wolf fur and cold iron. He watched her through half-closed eyes, his gaze never leaving her face. He saw the way her small, pale hands disappeared into the massive folds of his velvet cloak, her fingers twisting into the fur as if trying to bury herself within its warmth. To anyone looking through the frosted glass, they were a nobleman and his lady. Inside, they were a predator and a ghost, bound by a secret that could burn London to the ground. Eliza's breathing was shallow, a series of hitching gasps that rattled in the silence of the cabin. The sensory contrast was overwhelming. The womb of the carriage, with its quilted red leather walls and the steady, golden flicker of the candles, felt like a hallucination. Just minutes ago, the world had been grey, cold, and smelling of the unwashed masses and the wooden rot of the platform. Now, the heat was so intense it made her dizzy. The flickering light played over the Duke's features, highlighting the hard line of his jaw and the jagged scar that ran just above his brow, a mark of a man who was no stranger to violence. "You are shaking," Alistair observed. It wasn't a question, nor was it particularly gentle. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the grim focus of a commander assessing a casualty. I am cold," Eliza managed to whisper, her voice cracking like dry parchment. "The cold is in your mind, Eliza. The rope is miles behind us." He reached out, his large, calloused hand covering both of hers where they gripped his cloak. His touch was startlingly hot, his palm spanning the entirety of her knuckles. He didn't squeeze, but the sheer weight of his hand acted as an anchor, pulling her back from the edge of the hysterical void she was staring into. She looked down at their joined hands, his adorned with a signet ring of heavy gold, hers bruised and trembling. The opulence of his world was a shield, but it was also a cage. She was huddled in the furs of a man she barely knew, a man who had been her father's secret correspondent, but a stranger to her until the moment he had snatched her from death. The realization of her total dependence on him began to settle in, heavier than the velvet. She wanted to ask why. Why risk the Ravenscroft name? Why save a woman the crown had already condemned? But the words wouldn't come. Her throat felt as though the hemp was still tightened around it, phantom fibers scratching at her windpipe. She simply leaned her head back against the plush red leather, closing her eyes as the carriage thundered on. The rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves was the only thing keeping her heart in time. Inside this sanctuary of shadows, the Duke's protective intent was a living thing, a wall of burgundy and fur that stood between her and the hangman. Yet, as the city lights faded into the dark expanse of the countryside, the trauma of her escape remained etched in her wide, haunted eyes, the expression of a fugitive who knew that even the most beautiful sanctuary was still a place to hide. The carriage accelerated as they cleared the city's edge, the cobblestones giving way to the rhythmic, hollow thud of packed earth. Inside the swaying cabin, the candlelight struggled against the encroaching darkness of the countryside. Eliza remained submerged in the Duke's heavy furs, her eyes fixed on the gold embroidery of his cuff. She was waiting for the mask of the savior to drop, for the bill of her life to be presented. "You haven't asked," the Duke said, his voice cutting through the hum of the wheels. He had moved to the opposite bench, giving her space, but somehow feeling more dominant for the distance. He sat with one spurred boot crossed over his knee, a position of relaxed but absolute authority. Eliza forced her gaze upward, meeting his intense, dark stare. "I was told I was to die tonight. Asking questions of the man who prevented it feels ungrateful." A shadow of a grim smile touched his lips, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Gratitude is a fragile currency, Lady Eliza. It usually devalues the moment the danger passes." He leaned forward into the light, and for the first time, she truly saw the man behind the rescue. "You know me by reputation, even if we have never shared a room until this midnight. I am Alistair Ravenscroft." The name hit her with more force than the carriage's sway. Cold dread, separate from the trauma of the gallows, seeped into her chest. Alistair Ravenscroft, the Iron Duke of the North. Her father had spoken of him in hushed, guarded tones. He was a man who ruled his vast, rugged estates with a hand of steel, whispered to have a temperament as jagged and unforgiving as the Yorkshire moors. In London, mothers used his name to quiet unruly children. In the halls of Parliament, men feared his silence more than most men's threats. "The Duke of Ravenscroft," she whispered, the words tasting of copper. "They say you don't care for the laws of the South, that you treat the king's edicts as mere suggestions." "They say many things," Alistair replied, his tone chillingly flat. "Most of them are understatements. The South is a place of whispers and gilded cages. The North is a place of survival, and right now survival is the only thing you possess." He reached into a hidden compartment of the carriage and pulled out a heavy, wax-sealed parchment. "The High Chancellor didn't want you dead because you committed a crime, Eliza. He wanted you dead because your father left you the key to his downfall, a ledger of names and debts that leads directly to the Chancellor's throat. I have been looking for that ledger for 3 years." Eliza pulled the wolf fur tighter, her knuckles white. She realized then that this was not a simple act of chivalry. "So, this is a bargain. You didn't save me out of mercy. You saved me because I am a witness." "I saved you because you are a Hawthorne," Alistair corrected, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "And because I do not allow the men who sit in London to decide who lives and dies in my territory. But make no mistake, by pulling you from that platform, I have made you a ghost. To the world, you are dead. If you step outside my protection, the law will finish what it started. You belong to the North now. You belong to the shadows of Ravenscroft Hall." The word belong hung in the air, heavy and possessive. Eliza looked at his large, calloused hands, the hands of a man who broke horses and held empires together, and realized she had traded the executioner's rope for the Duke's iron grip. He was a predator, shielding her from other wolves, but a predator nonetheless. "And if I cannot give you what you want," she asked, her voice trembling but steady, "if the ledger is lost?" Alistair leaned back into the shadows, his face obscured except for the cold, amber glint in his eyes. "Then you are merely a very expensive guest of the state, and I am a man who hates to lose an investment." The carriage tilted sharply as they took a bend at high speed, and Eliza felt the crushing weight of her new reality. She was safe, yes, but she was a prisoner of a different sort, tucked away in a velvet-lined cell by the most feared man in England. As the candles flickered lower, she realized the rescue was merely the beginning of a much longer, much darker game. The rhythmic thunder of the horses' hooves suddenly faltered, the cadence shifting from a frantic gallop to a cautious, jarring trot. Outside, the world was no longer a blur of shadows. The yellow glow of lanterns pierced the frosted glass, and the sharp, military command to halt in the name of the king cut through the rattling of the harness. Eliza's heart lurched into her throat, the phantom sensation of the rope returning with agonizing clarity. The carriage groaned to a standstill, the silence that followed more terrifying than the roar of the crowd. "The gate," she whispered, her wide eyes darting to the door. "They're searching for me." Alistair didn't hesitate. His movements were a blur of burgundy and shadow. "Get down," he commanded, his voice a low, vibrating growl. He didn't wait for her to comply. He reached across the small space and hauled her from her seat, pulling her toward him. Before she could protest, Eliza found herself forced into the narrow space between the Duke's knees. She was small, already huddled in his furs, but he moved with a ruthless efficiency, tucking her against his lap and draping the massive, wolf-skin collar of his cloak over her head. The world vanished. She was suddenly submerged in a lightless, airless heat, pressed against the hard muscle of his thighs and the coarse, expensive wool of his trousers. "Not a sound," he murmured, his hand coming down to rest heavily on the back of her neck, pinning her gently but firmly in place. The carriage door creaked open, admitting a blast of freezing night air that hissed against the Duke's boots. Eliza squeezed her eyes shut, her face pressed against the Duke's stomach. Through the thick layers of velvet and fur she could hear it, the slow, steady and terrifyingly calm thud of Alistair Ravenscroft's heart. It didn't skip a beat. It didn't race with the panicked fluttering of her own. It was a cold, deliberate drum, the heartbeat of a man who looked at danger and didn't blink. "Your Grace," a voice from the outside said, sounding uncertain, My apologies for the delay. We are under orders from the High Chancellor to inspect every carriage leaving the city. A prisoner has escaped the gallows." A prisoner, Alistair's voice, was a masterpiece of bored, aristocratic arrogance. It rumbled through his chest, vibrating against Eliza's ear. "And you think she is hiding in my boots, Lieutenant, or perhaps behind my silk cushions?" "No, Your Grace, but the orders are absolute." "My orders are also absolute," Alistair snapped, the temperature in the carriage seeming to drop with his tone. "I am expected at Ravenscroft Hall by dawn. My wife is ill, resting under these very furs, and if you wake her with your clumsy searching, I shall ensure your commission is as dead as the woman you've lost. Do I make myself clear?" Eliza held her breath until her lungs burned. She felt the weight of the Duke's hand tighten on her neck, a silent command to remain motionless. She could feel the heat of his body radiating through her thin bodice, the only thing keeping her from shattering into 1,000 pieces of pure terror. She was a fugitive, a ghost, hidden beneath the skin of a wolf, protected by the very man the law was too afraid to challenge. There was a long, agonizing pause. The sound of metal clinking, the lieutenant's sword hitting his stirrup, was the only noise in the night. "My apologies, Duke Ravenscroft. Proceed. Open the gate." The door slammed shut, the latch clicking like a guillotine blade. The carriage lurched forward, at first slowly, then breaking into a punishing pace as they cleared the city walls and headed for the open moors. Alistair didn't release her immediately. He waited until the lantern light of the checkpoint was a distant spark in the dark before he pulled back the heavy fur. Eliza emerged gasping, her hair disheveled, and her face flushed from the heat and the proximity. She looked up at him, her chest heaving, her eyes searching his for some sign of the man who had just lied to the crown for her. He didn't look triumphant. He looked grim, his jaw set like granite as he stared out the window into the blackness of the north. He had claimed her as his wife to the guards, a lie of convenience, yet it felt like a brand. "We are clear of the city," he said, his voice returning to its cold, detached baritone. "But the Chancellor's hounds have a long scent. From this moment on, Eliza, you do not exist. You are a shadow in my house and nothing more." She sank back into the red leather seat, the steady thrum of his heartbeat still echoing in her ears. She was safe for now, but as the carriage sped into the wilderness, she realized the sanctuary of shadows was becoming more real with every mile. The carriage climbed higher into the desolate moors, the air outside turning sharp and thin as it whistled through the door seals. Inside, the red-quilted cabin felt like a confession box, the flickering candles burning low as they fought the draft. Eliza sat wrapped in the Duke's burgundy velvet, the warmth of the furs no longer enough to stop the trembling that started deep in her marrow. The silence between them had become a living thing, heavy with the weight of the names and dates she carried in her mind. "He didn't just want me dead for a crime, Your Grace," Eliza began, her voice a fragile thread in the dark. "He wanted me dead because I am the only one left who saw the ink on the page." Alistair turned his head, his face a landscape of hard shadows in the amber light. "The ledger, your father's final legacy." "My father wasn't just a clerk for the High Chancellor," she whispered, her fingers twisting a loose thread of the Duke's cloak. "He was his conscience, until it became too heavy to carry. The ledger isn't a book of taxes or trade. It is a record of the blacklist, a series of orchestrated accidents and wrongful executions designed to clear the path for the Chancellor's rise. My execution was to be the final entry, the closing of the circle." She looked at Alistair, her wide eyes reflecting a sudden, piercing clarity. "The night they came for him, he didn't give me a book. He gave me a location, a hollow stone in the Hawthorne family crypt. But the Chancellor thinks I have it on me. He thinks I am the book." Alistair's jaw tightened, the jagged scar above his brow twitching. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man seeing the final piece of a grim puzzle fall into place. "The Chancellor isn't just a corrupt politician, Eliza. He is a scavenger. If he believes that ledger exists, he won't stop at the city gates. He will burn every bridge between here and the Scottish border to find you." Suddenly the carriage lurched. It wasn't the unevenness of the road, but a deliberate, frantic increase in speed. A sharp whistle pierced the night, followed by the frantic cracking of a whip against the horse's flanks. Through the small, frosted pane, Eliza saw the shadow of their driver leaning low, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "Alistair," she breathed, using his name for the first time without thinking. The Duke stood, bracing his hand against the roof of the carriage. He didn't answer. He reached for the small leather strap that allowed him to see the road behind them. He peered into the blackness of the moors, his expression turning to one of predatory focus. "Light," he muttered, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. "What?" "Torches," he said, slamming the viewing port shut. "6 riders, maybe more. They aren't the King's Guard. The Guard rides in formation. These men are riding like hounds on a scent. The Chancellor didn't wait for the morning to discover you were gone. He had men waiting in the shadows of the gallows, watching for a ghost to fly." The realization hit Eliza like a physical blow. The sanctuary of the carriage was no longer a secret, it was a target. The womb of red leather and candlelight had become a moving trap. Every jolt of the wheels was now a heartbeat in a race they were already losing. "He knows," she whispered, the trauma of the rope returning to haunt her. "He knows I'm with you." Alistair turned to her, his burgundy cloak billowing as he moved to the hidden weapon rack beneath the seat. He pulled out a pair of heavy flintlock pistols, the cold steel gleaming in the candlelight. His expression was no longer one of a protective savior, but of the Iron Duke, a man prepared to turn the rugged north into a graveyard for anyone foolish enough to follow him. "Let him hunt," Alistair said, his voice as unforgiving as the Yorkshire stone. "He thinks he is chasing a girl and a nobleman. He has forgotten that on these moors, the Ravenscrofts are the only law that matters. But we cannot reach the hall by the main road. We must go higher." Leaned out the window, shouting a command to the driver that was lost to the wind, and the carriage banked hard to the left, veering off the path and onto the treacherous, unmapped tracks of the high moors. Eliza gripped the Duke's arm, her fingers digging into the velvet. Behind them, the distant, flickering orange of the torches grew brighter, cutting through the London mist that had followed them like a curse. The hunt had begun, and the thorns of the Hawthorne legacy were now drawing blood from everyone they touched. The carriage slowed to a precarious crawl as the wheels churned through a mire of half-frozen mud and heather. Outside, the moors had become a void of howling wind, but through the driving sleet, the jagged silhouette of a stone hunting lodge emerged. It was a bleak, fortress-like structure, forgotten by the sun and hidden by the spine of the hills. When the door finally groaned open, Eliza was half-carried by Alistair into the interior, her legs numb and her mind still echoing with the thunder of the pursuit. The lodge was a hollow shell of cold stone and dust, but Alistair moved with a frantic efficiency, kicking a path through the debris to the massive hearth. Within minutes, he had coaxed a fire into life using old peat and dry timber. The orange flames licked at the damp air, casting long, distorted shadows of the Duke against the walls. Eliza sat on a low, moth-eaten settee, still wrapped in the burgundy cloak, her eyes fixed on the fire as if it were a holy relic. The silence of the lodge was profound, broken only by the crackle of the hearth and the distant, lonely cry of the wind. "The horses are spent," Alistair said, his voice rough with exhaustion. He stood by the fire, his heavy coat removed, his white shirt stained with the soot of the moors. "They cannot follow us tonight, not in this storm. We have a few hours of grace." He turned to her, his gaze sweeping over her small, huddled form. "You are still shivering. The cloak is damp from the sleet." "It's not the cold," she whispered, though her teeth chattered in a rhythm she couldn't control. Alistair crossed the room, his presence filling the small circle of warmth. He knelt before her, his large hands reaching out to unfasten the silver clasp of the cloak. Eliza flinched, a small, instinctive movement, and Alistair froze. For a moment, the predator in him seemed to recoil, replaced by a strange, heavy stillness. "I am not the hangman, Eliza," he said softly, his voice lower than she had ever heard it. He eased the heavy velvet from her shoulders. Without the shroud of his furs, Eliza felt painfully exposed. Her thin bodice was translucent from the dampness, clinging to her skin. As the light of the fire hit her, Alistair's breath hitched in his chest. Across the delicate line of her collarbone and disappearing beneath the frayed lace of her chemise were the marks of her captivity, angry yellow-purple bruises where the guards had been too rough, and the raw, red chafing at the base of her throat, where the hemp had begun its work. before he cut her down. Alistair's hand reached out, his thumb hovering just inches from the marks on her neck. His fingers, usually so steady on a trigger or a rein, were trembling. The Duke of Ravenscroft, a man built of iron and ancestral pride, looked down at the evidence of her suffering, and the first layer of his armor visibly melted. The grim, detached mask he had worn since London cracked, revealing a raw, jagged fury that wasn't directed at her, but at the world that had dared to touch her. "They did this," he murmured, his thumb finally brushing the reddened skin. His touch was as light as a falling leaf, a startling contrast to the violence of his reputation. Eliza looked up at him, her haunted eyes searching his. In the golden glow of the peat fire, she saw the moisture in his gaze, a glimmer of a tear that he refused to let fall. "I was a traitor to them," she said, her voice a ghost of a sound. "I was a thing to be broken." "You are a Hawthorne," he growled, his hand moving to cup her cheek, his palm warm and calloused. "And you are under the protection of the North. I would have burned London to the ground to keep them from marking you like this." He rose and fetched a tin of salve from his traveling bag, returning to sit beside her. With a tenderness that seemed to physically pain him, he began to apply the cool ointment to the bruises on her arms and neck. The intimacy of the act was overwhelming. In the sanctuary of the lodge, the roles of duke and fugitive began to dissolve. They were merely two haunted souls, one scarred by the law and the other by the weight of his own power. Eliza watched him, her heart slowing for the first time since the bell had tolled. She saw the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way he held his breath, as if he feared his own strength might shatter her. This was the man her father had trusted, not the Iron Duke of the Moors, but a man who felt the sting of every lash laid upon the innocent. "Why did you really come for me?" she asked, her voice steadying. "My father's ledger is a powerful thing, but you risked high treason for a girl you had never met." Alistair stopped his work, his hand resting on her shoulder. He looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in the dark depths of his eyes. "Your father saved my life when I was a boy, Eliza, long before the titles and the steel. He hid me from men who would have had me dead for my inheritance. I owed him a debt of blood. I only wish I had reached him before the Chancellor did." He turned back to her, and for the first time, he didn't look like a predator. He looked like a man seeking redemption. "I couldn't save the father, but I will die before I let them take the daughter." Eliza reached out, her small hand covering his. The contrast remained, the fragile and the formidable, but the fear was gone. In the flickering light of the hearth, surrounded by the ghosts of the haunted moors, she realized that she was no longer just a ghost in his carriage. She was a woman who had found a different kind of sanctuary, one that didn't just hide her, but began to heal her. The peace of the lodge was shattered not by a shout, but by a sound that made the blood in Eliza's veins turn to ice, the low, rhythmic baying of hounds. It was a mournful, hungry sound, drifting through the pre-dawn mist like a physical curse. Alistair was on his feet before the echo died away, his hand already gripping the hilt of his heavy hunting knife. The warmth of the hearth, so hard-won only hours ago, felt suddenly like a beacon for their hunters. "The black hounds," he muttered, his voice a razor-edged snarl. "The Chancellor's personal curs. They've tracked the scent of the carriage grease, and the horses sweat through the storm." He didn't waste a second. He threw the burgundy cloak over Eliza's shoulders, his touch no longer hesitant but electric with the urgency of survival. Outside, the world was a wall of grey vapor. The carriage sat like a grounded ship in the heather, the horses shivering and blowing plumes of steam into the freezing air. As they scrambled inside, the baying grew louder, closer, accompanied now by the rhythmic thud of hooves against the sodden earth. "Drive," Alistair roared to the coachman, slamming the door. The carriage lurched with a violent snap of the harness. Eliza was thrown against the red leather padding as the wheels spun, biting deep into the peat before finding purchase. Then they were flying. This was no longer a journey. It was a desperate, blind flight through a landscape that wanted them dead. The moors were a treacherous labyrinth of hidden bogs and jagged limestone clints, and the fog turned every turn into a potential plunge into a ravine. Through the rear viewing port, Eliza saw them, 6 riders appearing like specters out of the mist. They wore the dark, faceless liveries of the Chancellor's private guard, their horses large and powerful, bred for the chase. They were gaining. The orange flicker of their torches was gone, replaced by the cold, steel glint of unsheathed sabers. "They aren't trying to stop us," Eliza cried over the roar of the wind. "They're trying to run us off the cliff." Alistair didn't answer. He had braced himself against the door, his jaw set in a line of pure granite. He reached for the heavy flintlock pistols he had prepared, checking the priming pans with steady fingers. "The high road narrows at the devil's throat," he said, more to himself than to her. "If we can reach the pass, they can only come at us one by one." The carriage swayed sickeningly to the left, a wheel leaving the ground as they took a corner on two spokes. Eliza gripped the Duke's arm, her knuckles white, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The contrast between the plush, candlelit interior and the violent, grey world outside had never felt more terrifying. She was a lady of the court, a creature of ballrooms and tea services, now being hunted like a fox across the roof of England. A shot rang out, a sharp, dry crack that pierced the howl of the wind. The lead ball whistled through the air, shattering the glass of the rear window. Eliza screamed, ducking into the furs as shards of crystal showered the red velvet like diamonds. Alistair didn't flinch. He leaned out of the broken window, the freezing wind whipping his dark hair back from his scarred brow. He waited. He was a man who knew the rhythm of the moors, who understood that in a chase, the one who fired first usually lost. The lead rider moved closer, his saber raised for a strike at the carriage's rear axle. The Duke fired. The roar of the pistol was deafening in the confined space. Through the smoke, Eliza saw the lead rider's horse stumble, its front legs giving way. The man was thrown headlong into the heather, and the riders behind him had to veer sharply to avoid the carnage. It bought them seconds, nothing more. "You have to get to the pass," Eliza shouted, her voice trembling. "The ledger, if I die, it dies with me." "You aren't going to die," Alistair growled, reaching for the second pistol. He looked at her then, and for a fleeting second, the Iron Duke vanished. There was a desperate, protective fire in his eyes that had nothing to do with debts or ledgers. "I didn't pull you from the gallows to lose you to a pack of hired dogs." The carriage hit a stretch of limestone, the vibration so intense it threatened to shake the frame apart. The horses were screaming now, their lungs burning, their lathered coats white with foam. The hounds were almost at the door, their snapping jaws visible through the mist. Then the ground seemed to fall away. The carriage banked into a terrifyingly narrow track, stone walls rising up on either side like the jaws of a trap. This was the devil's throat. The wind here was a physical force, funneled through the rock, screaming with a high, discordant note. The riders slowed, forced into a single file by the narrowing path. Alistair took his aim again, his body absorbing the jolts of the carriage with a practiced, rugged grace. As the second pistol barked, a landslide of loose shale, loosened by the horse's hooves and the Duke's shot, began to tumble from the heights above. "Hold on," Alistair yelled, throwing his body over hers. The world turned into a roar of crashing stone and splintering wood. The carriage groaned under the impact of falling debris, tilting precariously over the edge of the pass before the driver managed to whip the horses into a final, agonizing surge. They cleared the bottleneck just as the path behind them was choked by a wall of grey stone, cutting off the baying of the hounds and the thunder of the pursuit. For a long time, the only sound was the frantic sobbing of the horses and the creak of the damaged carriage. They were alive. They were into the high north now, where the mist was thicker and the secrets were deeper. But as Eliza pulled herself from the Duke's arms, she realized the chase had changed something. The Chancellor wasn't just hunting a girl anymore, he was at war with the Duke of Ravenscroft. And as she looked at Alistair's grim, blood-smudged face, she knew the real battle had only just begun. The carriage had slowed to a funereal pace as it wound through the iron-grey crags of the upper moors. The interior was a wreck of its former opulence. The shattered window had been stuffed with a spare wool blanket, but the freezing wind still whistled through the gaps, causing the candle flames to dance like dying spirits. Alistair had climbed outside to assist the driver with a damaged harness, leaving Eliza alone in the red leather sanctuary that now felt more like a cage. Restless and bone-chilled, she sought a heavier blanket from the hidden floor compartment. Her fingers brushed against a leather dispatch case she hadn't noticed before, tucked deep behind the velvet upholstery. It was embossed with the royal seal, the Chancellor's mark. Thinking it might contain the very evidence her father had died to protect, she pried it open with trembling hands. The first parchment she pulled out was not a ledger of the Chancellor's crimes. It was a warrant. Her breath hitched, the air turning to ice in her lungs. The document was dated 3 weeks prior, addressed to the Duke of Ravenscroft. It was a direct order from the Crown to apprehend Lady Eliza Hawthorne on sight and deliver her to the Tower of London for execution. But it was the second paper that broke her heart. It was a letter in Alistair's own heavy, authoritative hand, addressed back to the Chancellor's office. "I have the scent," it read. "The girl is irrelevant, but the Hawthorne name must be extinguished to secure the North. I shall bring her in by the 1st of the month." The world tilted. The womb of red leather suddenly felt like a tomb. Every touch of his hand, every moment of shared warmth in the hunting lodge, every protective glance, it all dissolved into the bitter ash of a calculated lie. He hadn't snatched her from the gallows out of a debt to her father. He had intercepted her for his own political gain, perhaps to trade her life for more power in the North. The carriage door groaned open. Alistair climbed back inside, his face smudged with grease and soot, his eyes immediately searching for hers. He stopped mid-motion, his gaze dropping to the dispatch case in her lap and the parchment clutched in her white-knuckled grip. The silence that followed was more violent than the chase through the devil's throat. "Eliza," he said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "You were meant to arrest me," she whispered, her voice cracking like thin ice. She held the letter up, the royal seal mocking her in the flickering light. "The girl is irrelevant. Was that the plan, Your Grace, to save me from a public noose only to deliver me to a private one when it suited your ledgers?" Alistair sat heavily on the opposite bench. He didn't reach for the papers. He didn't even look ashamed. He looked tired, a weariness that reached into the marrow of his bones. "That letter was written before I saw you on that platform, Eliza, before I saw what they had done to you." "Does it matter?" she flared, the trauma of the night finally boiling over into a raw, jagged fury. She threw the papers at his feet. "You lied. You played the savior while holding the shackles behind your back. I am nothing more than an investment to you, just as you said. A pawn to be moved across your northern chessboards." She lunged for the door handle, her mind screaming for the cold freedom of the moors, preferring the teeth of the black hounds to the betrayal of the man she had begun to trust. Alistair was faster. He lunged across the cabin, his large hands catching her wrists and pinning them against the padded wall. "Let me go," she shrieked, struggling against his superior strength. "Look at me," he roared, the sound vibrating through the small carriage. He held her there, his chest heaving, his face inches from hers. The predator mask was gone, replaced by a desperate, agonizing sincerity. "Yes, I took those orders. I intended to bring you in because the Chancellor held my brother's life in exchange for yours. I thought you were just another spoiled lady of the court caught in a web of greed." He leaned closer, his grip on her wrists softening into a plea. "But then I saw you standing there in the rain. I saw the way you looked at the stars as if you were already a part of them. And when I held you, when I saw the marks on your neck, I realized I couldn't do it. I chose treason, Eliza. I chose to burn my life to the ground to keep yours burning." Eliza stopped struggling, her chest heaving as she searched his dark, haunted eyes. The heat of his body was the same heat that had kept her alive in the mist, but the trust was a fractured thing, jagged and sharp. "How do I know this isn't another mask?" she asked, her voice a broken whisper. "How do I know you won't change your mind when the Chancellor offers you a better price?" Alistair released her wrists. Slowly, he reached for the heavy flintlock pistol at his belt and placed it in her lap, the cold steel a heavy weight against her thighs. "You don't," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "But if you believe I am your enemy, pull the trigger now, because I will not stop until you are safe at Ravenscroft Hall, even if I have to carry you there through a sea of the king's blood." Eliza looked down at the weapon, then back at the man who had lied to save her. The shadows in the carriage seemed to lengthen, blurring the line between protector and captor. She didn't pick up the gun. Instead, she let out a long, shuddering breath, the weight of the betrayal settling into a cold, hard resolve. "The 1st of the month has passed, Your Grace," she said, her voice hollow. "You are officially a traitor." I have been a traitor since the moment I touched you, Alistair replied, his gaze never wavering. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers but not touching. The distance between them had never felt wider, yet the bond, forged in blood, mist, and a ledger of lies, was now the only thing keeping either of them alive. Outside, the first light of a grey, unforgiving dawn began to bleed over the horizon, revealing the jagged peaks of the north that would either be their sanctuary or their grave. The sanctuary of Ravenscroft Hall was a fortress of cold stone and ancient silence, but for Eliza, it was merely a dressing room for a suicide mission. The north had offered her a brief, bitter reprieve, a place to heal the skin of her neck while the soul beneath remained raw. Now the carriage stood waiting in the courtyard once more, its red leather interior refreshed, but its purpose far more lethal. They were returning to London. A ghost cannot walk into a ballroom and expect to be heard, Eliza. She must walk in as if she owns the air everyone else is breathing. Alistair stood before her in the great hall, the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows catching the silver embroidery of his formal evening coat. He was no longer the rugged protector of the moors. He was a duke of the realm, a figure of terrifying, polished elegance. He held a silk masquerade mask in his hand, a fox, cast in charcoal and gold. "I don't know how to be her," Eliza whispered. She was dressed in a gown of midnight lace that seemed to absorb the light, her hair coiled tight and pinned with diamonds that felt like ice against her scalp. "I still feel the rope. Every time I swallow, I feel the hemp." Alistair stepped into her space, his presence as overwhelming as the day he had snatched her from the gallows. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to tilt her chin upward with a firm, demanding finger. "The rope is a memory. The Chancellor is a man. You will not look at him as a victim looks at an executioner. You will look at him as a judge looks at a thief." "How?" she asked, her breath hitching. "My hands won't stop shaking." "Then hide them," he commanded. He took her hands in his grip steadying the tremors by sheer force of will. "Use the weight of the silk. Use the height of your heels. Nobility is not a birthright, Eliza, it is a performance. It is the ability to look at a lie and make the world believe it is the truth." He began to pace around her, his voice a low, rhythmic drone that mimicked the swaying of a carriage. He was teaching her the masquerade of justice, the way to glide without moving her shoulders, the way to hold a fan like a dagger, and the way to keep her gaze level and freezing. He pushed her, critiquing the slight slump of her spine, the way her eyes darted toward the exits. "Again," he barked when she faltered. "If you look afraid, they will smell the Newgate cells on you. You must be untouchable. You are the Duchess of Nothing, a phantom come to reclaim a kingdom." Hours bled into the afternoon. Eliza practiced until her feet ached and her neck felt as stiff as the stone walls surrounding them. But slowly, the learned helplessness of her captivity began to shed. Under Alistair's relentless tutelage, the fragile girl who had huddled in his furs was replaced by something sharper, something forged in the cold northern winds. "Better," he murmured, stopping in front of her. He picked up the fox mask and fitted it to her face, his fingers lingering near the scars he had once treated with salve. "When we enter the Chancellor's ball tonight, I will be at your side, but I cannot speak for you. You carry the ledger in your mind. You are the weapon. I am merely the hand that wields it." Eliza looked at him through the narrow slits of the mask. The contrast between them remained, the predator and his protégé, but the power dynamic had shifted. She saw the tension in his jaw, the silent acknowledgement that he was risking his ancestral seat, his title, and his life for this gambit. "You taught me how to hide my fear," she said. Her voice sounding foreign even to her own ears, colder, steadier. "But what about you, Alistair? Your heart was steady at the checkpoint. Is it steady now?" Alistair went still. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the Duke's mask slipped. There was a raw, jagged longing in his eyes that had nothing to do with politics or ledgers. "My heart has not been steady since the moment I touched you on that platform, Eliza, but for you, I will make the world believe it is made of stone." He offered his arm, a formal invitation to their shared destruction. Eliza took it, her lace-gloved hand resting lightly on his velvet sleeve. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt like a storm, contained and directed. As they walked toward the carriage, The London fog seemed to reach out from the horizon to meet them, a grey shroud waiting to be pierced. The masquerade was no longer just a dance, it was a battleground. And as the door of the red-lined carriage clicked shut, Eliza realized she had learned the Duke's greatest lesson. The most dangerous weapon in England wasn't a pistol or a ledger, but a woman who had already died once and had absolutely nothing left to lose. The ballroom of the High Chancellor's estate was a gilded cage of light and heat, smelling of gardenias and the cloying, sweet rot of excess. Violins wept from the gallery, their music weaving through the laughter of 1,000 guests who danced upon the very ground where blood had been spilled in secret. At the center of the hall, the Chancellor stood, a man of silver hair and eyes as cold as a winter coin, holding court with the easy confidence of a king. Then the great oak doors swung open, and the music faltered as if the breath had been sucked from the room. Duke Alistair Ravenscroft entered, a towering shadow of burgundy and steel. At his side, draped in midnight lace and masked in charcoal and gold, walked a woman whose presence felt like a sudden drop in temperature. She didn't walk, she glided, her chin tilted at the precise, freezing angle Alistair had carved into her soul. Through the slits of her fox mask, Eliza saw the Chancellor's smile falter. He didn't recognize her, not yet, but he recognized the threat. "Your Grace," the Chancellor said, his voice smooth as oil as they approached the center of the floor. "We heard rumors of your absence from the city, and who is this phantom you bring to our feast?" Alistair did not bow. He stood with his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword, his expression a mask of ancestral pride. "A guest who has traveled a long way to settle an account, Chancellor. She has a story to tell, one that begins at midnight on a wooden platform." A ripple of uneasy murmurs moved through the crowd. Eliza stepped forward, breaking her silence. The learned helplessness of her past was gone, replaced by the jagged resolve of the North. She felt the weight of the diamonds on her scalp like a crown of thorns, reminding her of the cost of her survival. "It is a story of a ledger," Eliza said, her voice clear and resonant, slicing through the perfume and the candlelight. "A record of the blacklist of names like Hawthorne and others who were cleared from your path by a rope that was bought and paid for." The Chancellor's face went ash pale, the silver of his hair suddenly looking like the shroud he had intended for her. "I know not what madness this is. Guards." "The guards are mine tonight," Alistair growled, his voice a low thunder that silenced the room. "Every entrance to this hall is held by the men of the North. You are not in London now, Chancellor. You are in the court of the Iron Duke." Eliza reached up, her movements slow and deliberate. She unfastened the silk ribbons of her mask and let it fall to the marble floor with a soft, final thud. The gasps from the guests were a chorus of shock. The scars on her neck were visible above the lace of her gown, raw, red marks that no amount of powder could hide. She looked like a ghost come to reclaim her life, her wide, haunted eyes now burning with a fire that made the Chancellor recoil. "I am Eliza Hawthorne," she declared, and for the first time she felt the phantom rope truly snap. "The woman you tried to hang at midnight. I carry my father's ledger in my mind, every name, every date, and every bribe, and I am not alone." She reached into the folds of her gown and pulled out a single, crumpled parchment, the Duke's original orders to arrest her, signed by the Chancellor's own hand. She didn't hand it to him, she held it up for the room to see, the royal seal a brand of betrayal. "You didn't just want me dead," she said, stepping into his personal space, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly steady whisper. "You wanted the North. You used the Duke to hunt me, never realizing that a wolf protects his own." The Chancellor looked to the edges of the room, realizing too late that his power had evaporated in the face of a truth that was no longer hidden. The high society guests, the very people he had ruled through fear and favor, were already beginning to turn, their faces reflecting the horror of his crimes. Alistair stepped beside her, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. The weight of it was no longer a cage, but an anchor. "The noose is a heavy thing, Chancellor," the Duke said, his eyes reflecting the flickering candles like amber glass, "and tonight it has found a new neck." As the King's black hounds, the true ones, led by the Duke's own lieutenants, entered the hall to take the Chancellor into custody, Eliza felt a strange, hollow peace. The gallows had been reversed. The man who had sought to extinguish her name was being led away into the same darkness he had created. The music did not resume. The silence was absolute as Alistair led Eliza toward the doors. As they stepped out into the cool London night, the fog was finally lifting, revealing a sky full of cold, distant stars. The carriage waited in the shadows, its red leather interior glowing like a coal in the dark. Alistair stopped at the door, looking down at her. He didn't see a victim or a ghost. He saw the woman who had stood in the center of a storm and refused to break. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice finally trembling. Alistair reached out, his thumb brushing the skin of her neck where the scars would eventually fade. "For the ghost, yes," he said softly. "For the woman, the North is waiting." He handed her into the carriage, and as the door clicked shut, Eliza realized she was no longer hiding. She was going home. The Duke's furs were still warm, but as the horses broke into a gallop, she didn't huddle into them for protection. She sat upright, a Duchess of the North, riding toward a fate that was finally, irrevocably her own.